What in the world is wrong with you, buddy? Megan Harper threw up her hands in frustration as her golden retriever stopped dead in his tracks, his paws pressing against the hardwood floor just before the living room rug. His ears pinned back, tail tucked, and his big brown eyes darted between her and the carpet like it was a snake ready to strike. She had never seen him act this way before, not in the 2 years since she had adopted him from a shelter. Buddy was the happiest, most easygoing dog she had ever known. He greeted strangers with wagging enthusiasm, never shied away from a new adventure, and had a boundless curiosity that often got him into trouble. But now he wouldn't even step onto the carpet, not for a treat, not for his favorite toy, not even for Megan herself. Megan sighed, running a hand through her wavy blonde hair. She had just gotten home from work, exhausted from the long day at the veterinary clinic where she worked as a technician. All she wanted was to relax on the couch, maybe watch an episode of her favorite show while Buddy curled up at her feet like he always did. But instead she was standing here, watching her dog act like their living room rug had turned into a lava pit. She knelt down, tapping the carpet with her palm. "Come on, Bud. Look, it's fine. See?" Buddy whined softly, backing up a step. Megan frowned. "All right, what's going on with you?" She glanced around the living room. It was the same as always. Her dark blue couch in the center, the coffee table covered with magazines she never had time to read, and the big window overlooking the yard. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was different. Except for Buddy's strange behavior. Shaking her head, she stood up and walked into the kitchen. "Fine, be weird. I'll be over here eating snacks without you." Usually, that would have Buddy barreling after her. He was a food-motivated dog through and through. But today, he only sat down, still staring at the carpet like it might sprout claws and grab him. Megan poured herself a glass of iced tea, keeping one eye on him. Her dog had never been one to show fear. Even at the vet, when other dogs trembled at the sight of a thermometer, Buddy just wagged his tail and licked the technician's hands. Whatever was bothering him now had to be something big. She leaned against the counter, sipping her drink, debating whether she should just roll the carpet up and see if that helped. Maybe it had a weird smell. Maybe there was something stuck to it that she hadn't noticed. A few minutes later, curiosity got the best of her. She set her glass down and marched back into the living room. Buddy perked up at her movement, his body tense. "All right, let's get to the bottom of this." She crouched down at the edge of the rug, giving it a quick once-over. It looked normal, the same soft, cream-colored fabric that had been there for months. No weird stains, no loose threads, no sign of anything strange. Taking a deep breath, she pinched one corner and lifted it. A scream burst from her throat before she could stop it. She scrambled backward, nearly knocking over the coffee table as her heart slammed against her ribs. Buddy barked, his whole body tense, but he still didn't step onto the carpet. Megan stared at the floor beneath the rug, her breath coming in short, shaky bursts. For a long moment, she couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. It didn't belong there. It shouldn't be there. The floorboards beneath the carpet had been torn apart. Not just scratched, not just scuffed, but clawed and gouged. Deep marks running in jagged patterns, like something had tried to dig its way up from underneath. A chill ran down her spine. There was no explanation for this. None that made sense anyway. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to move closer again. Her fingers trembled as she touched one of the deep grooves in the wood. The marks were fresh. The edges of the wood were sharp, not softened with time. This hadn't been here a week ago, maybe not even a day ago. Buddy let out another whimper, and Megan looked at him, her heart still racing. He knew. He had known something was wrong before she did. That's why he wouldn't step on the carpet. Her pulse pounded in her ears. If this had just happened, then whatever did it could still be close. Maybe even inside the house. She shoved the rug aside completely, revealing more of the damage. The scratches were everywhere. Some looked deeper than others, like whatever had made them had gone at it with different levels of force. Her hands clenched into fists. Her brain scrambled for an explanation. Rats? No, not a chance. Not with claw marks this big. A dog? But Buddy never scratched the floor like this, and there were no stray dogs in the neighborhood. Megan's stomach twisted. This doesn't make sense. Buddy whined again, shifting on his paws. He looked torn, like he wanted to comfort her, but still didn't trust that spot on the floor. She needed to do something. Call someone. But who? The police? What would she even say? That her dog refused to step on a carpet, and when she lifted it, she found claw marks. No one would take that seriously. Her mind raced through possibilities before settling on one that made her stomach churn. She needed to check the basement. If something had clawed the floor from underneath, then the only place it could have come from was down there. She grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter, took a deep breath, and made her way toward the basement door. Buddy stayed right by her side, his warm fur brushing against her leg. At the top of the stairs, she hesitated. A cold, uneasy feeling crawled over her skin. She flicked the light switch. The single bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered weakly before holding steady. The basement looked as it always did, half storage, half workshop. Dusty shelves, old furniture, and a few holiday decorations she never got around to putting up. Megan took one step down, then another. Buddy whined but followed. His body was tense, his ears perked and alert. She reached the bottom, her pulse hammering in her throat. Everything looked normal at first glance. No signs of an intruder, no broken windows or doors. She scanned the concrete floor, the walls, the corners where the shadows stretched the longest. And then, she saw it. Near the center of the basement, right beneath where the living room rug had been upstairs, the floor was different. The concrete was cracked. Not in a natural way, not like old houses settling. This was deliberate. Jagged, uneven lines spreading outward like something had pushed from underneath. A new wave of dread settled over her. She swallowed against the lump in her throat and knelt down, pressing her hand to the cracked surface. It was warm. Too warm. Buddy let out a sharp bark, startling her so badly she nearly lost her balance. His hackles were raised, his eyes locked onto the broken floor like he expected something to burst through at any second. Megan's breath caught in her throat. Something was down there. Megan's breath came in short, shallow bursts as she stared at the cracked concrete. Her fingers twitched against the warm surface, heat pulsing beneath her palm in slow, rhythmic waves. Buddy let out another low whimper, his body rigid, muscles coiled like a spring. She forced herself to stay still, listening. The silence of the basement pressed in around her, thick and oppressive. No hum of the refrigerator upstairs, no distant sound of cars on the street, just her own heartbeat hammering in her ears, and Buddy's nervous breathing. She swallowed hard, pressing her hand more firmly against the cracked concrete. It didn't make sense. The basement should have been cool, the way it always was. But this felt unnatural. Like something beneath the house was alive. Megan clenched her jaw and pushed herself upright. She wasn't the type to scare easily. She'd grown up with 3 older brothers, spent her childhood proving she could handle whatever they threw at her. But this was different. Her fingers trembled as she pulled her phone from her pocket. She flicked on the flashlight, directing the beam toward the cracked floor. The light glinted off the jagged edges, casting deep shadows that made the break seem even larger than before. Buddy let out a sharp bark, stepping closer to her, his body pressed against her leg. His warmth was a comfort, an anchor in the midst of her growing unease. She took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "Okay," she murmured, mostly to herself. "No panicking. Let's figure this out." Carefully, she ran her fingers along the edges of the break. The concrete was rough, uneven, like something had forced its way through rather than crumbling naturally over time. She pressed her fingers into one of the deeper grooves, feeling how sharply the floor had splintered. It was then that she noticed something odd. The cracks didn't just go outward. They went downward, as if the break continued below the visible floor. Megan's heart gave an uneasy thump. If something had come up from underneath, where had it gone? She shook her head. That was ridiculous. Nothing had come up. This wasn't a horror movie. Taking a steadying breath, she reached for the metal toolbox resting against the basement wall. She fumbled for the small pry bar she kept inside, gripping the cold metal tightly. If there was anything loose beneath the cracked concrete, maybe she could lift a piece of it, see what was underneath. As she slid the tip of the bar into one of the thinner breaks, Buddy growled. A deep, rumbling sound that sent a shiver up her spine. "Buddy, it's okay," she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure it was. The pry bar scraped against the floor as she pushed down, trying to get enough leverage. The concrete groaned slightly, shifting just enough for her to see a sliver of darkness beneath. Her stomach clenched. Something moved. Megan jerked back, heart leaping into her throat. It had been subtle. Just the briefest flicker of motion, barely more than a shadow. But she had seen it. Buddy barked, his body tense, eyes locked on the crack. Megan gripped the pry bar tighter, forcing herself to take another look. Her flashlight beam trembled as she directed it back toward the gap in the floor. The darkness below seemed to stretch endlessly. It wasn't just a shallow break. There was space beneath the basement floor. A hollow space where there shouldn't have been one. Megan's breath caught. That wasn't normal. She sat back on her heels, her mind racing. Her house was old, sure, but she'd never heard of any kind of underground passage or forgotten crawlspace. And the fact that the concrete was warm, she needed help. Reaching for her phone again, she scrolled through her contacts. She needed someone who would believe her, someone who wouldn't laugh at her for freaking out over a warm floor and a strange gap in the basement. Her finger hovered over her brother Jake's name. He was a contractor, knew more about houses than anyone she could think of. If there was a logical explanation for this, he'd know it. She hit call. The phone rang twice before his voice came through. "Hey Meg, what's up?" "Jake, I need you to come over. Now." There was a pause. Everything okay? You sound weird. Just come, please. It's important." Another hesitation. Then, all right. I'm on my way." She hung up, exhaling slowly. Relief settled in her chest, but it was short-lived, because Buddy was still standing there, still staring at the broken floor, his tail stiff, his whole body radiating tension. Something was down there. Megan's grip tightened on the pry bar, her pulse quickening. She had no idea what she was dealing with, but she wasn't going to sit around waiting for it to make the next move. She was going to find out what was beneath her house. Buddy let out a quiet whine as Megan reached for the largest piece of loosened concrete and pulled. Megan's fingers wrapped around the edge of the loosened concrete, her breath caught in her throat. Buddy whined again, shifting anxiously beside her, his warm body pressed against her leg. Her heart pounded as she hesitated for the briefest moment before pulling. The broken slab of concrete lifted just an inch before the weight of it settled in her arms, heavy and unbalanced. Dust billowed from the opening, and a deep, earthy scent filled her nose. Damp, ancient, something untouched for years. A dark void stretched below. It wasn't just a small space or a crack in the foundation. It was something deeper. Megan grabbed her flashlight and directed the beam inside. The light cut through the dust, revealing a narrow tunnel beneath the house. The walls were made of packed earth, uneven and rough, and as she traced the beam forward, she could see that it extended far beyond what she had expected. Her throat tightened. Tunnels? Beneath her house? That wasn't possible. Buddy growled low in his throat, his ears pinned back as he inched forward to sniff the air. Megan swallowed hard and sat back on her heels. This wasn't some small animal burrow. It was deliberate. The question was, who or what had made it? She glanced at her phone. Jake was still at least 10 minutes away, and every nerve in her body screamed for her to wait. But another part of her, the part that had always been restless and curious, needed to know what was down there. Gritting her teeth, she grabbed a thick work glove from her toolbox, yanked it onto one hand, and reached down, feeling along the edge of the hole. The dirt crumbled beneath her fingers, soft and cool, and something about the texture felt wrong. She scooped up a handful and brought it closer to the flashlight. There was something mixed in, tiny, fine fragments of... Her breath hitched. Bone? Megan recoiled, shaking her hand as if she could rid herself of the unsettling realization. The soil wasn't just earth. It was laced with small, broken pieces of bone, some darkened with age, others fresh. A cold shudder ran down her spine. Buddy let out a sudden, sharp bark, his body stiffening beside her. Megan turned, her grip tightening around the flashlight. The air around them had shifted. It was heavier, charged with something unseen. Then she heard it, a noise from deep within the tunnel. Not a scurrying animal, not the groan of shifting earth. Something else. A faint, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. Megan's pulse roared in her ears. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare into the dark tunnel and listen. The sound was steady. Inhale, exhale. Something was down there. Something was... She jerked back so fast she nearly lost her balance. Her mind screamed at her to slam the concrete slab back over the hole, to pretend she had never seen it, never heard anything, never uncovered what lay beneath her home. But she couldn't. She had to know. She aimed the flashlight deeper into the tunnel, her hand trembling. The beam wavered over the dirt walls, past twisted roots that had broken through the soil, before settling on something further ahead. Megan's stomach turned. There, partially buried in the earth, was a set of old, tattered clothes. A jacket, faded and torn. A shoe, caked in dirt. And beside them, just visible in the flickering light, were fingers. Megan barely choked back a scream. She scrambled to her feet, heart hammering against her ribs. Buddy barked wildly now, his body rigid with alarm. Megan stumbled back, knocking over the toolbox, sending wrenches and screwdrivers clattering across the basement floor. Her mind reeled. This wasn't just some forgotten space beneath her house. Someone had been down there. Someone had never made it out. The breathing sound came again, closer this time. Megan turned and ran, grabbing Buddy's collar and yanking him with her as she scrambled up the basement steps. Her shaking hands fumbled for the doorknob, finally twisting it open, and she burst into the kitchen, slamming the door behind her. She gasped for air, pressing her back against the solid wood. Buddy whined and pawed at her leg, his ears still pinned back. Megan gripped her phone with trembling fingers and hit redial. Jake picked up after one ring. "Meg, almost there. What's—" "Hurry!" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Please, just get here now." "Meg, what's going on?" His tone shifted from confusion to concern. "Are you okay?" Megan swallowed hard, squeezing her eyes shut. "Just get here. I'll explain when you do." She hung up before he could press further. Her chest heaved as she tried to steady herself. But no matter how many breaths she took, the truth wouldn't change. There was something beneath her house, and it was still alive. Megan paced the kitchen, her fingers gripping the edges of the counter as she struggled to steady her breath. The air around her felt heavy, her mind spinning with the impossibility of what she had just seen. Buddy sat close to her, his body tense, ears flicking at every slight noise. The warmth of his fur against her leg grounded her, but it wasn't enough to shake the icy dread that curled around her spine. Jake had to hurry. She reached for her glass of water, her fingers trembling as she brought it to her lips. The cool liquid barely touched her throat before she set it down, her stomach twisting. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to leave the house, to get as far away as possible. But at the same time, something rooted her in place. Curiosity. Fear. An overwhelming need to know what had happened in that tunnel. The rhythmic breathing sound she'd heard. It hadn't been her imagination. She was sure of it. And the fingers, the old clothing buried in the dirt, they meant something. Someone had been down there. But the question that made her blood run cold was, were they still there? The sound of tires crunching over gravel made her heart jump. She rushed to the window, spotting Jake's truck pulling into the driveway. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. The moment she turned back toward the basement door, the weight of what she had discovered pressed down on her again. She met Jake at the front door before he could knock. "Okay, what's going on?" He frowned as he stepped inside, taking in her pale face and the way Buddy stuck close to her side. "Meg, you sounded freaked out on the phone." "I am." She took a breath, trying to put the right words together. "I found something in the basement, under the house. You need to see it." Jake's frown deepened. "What do you mean, under the house?" She ran a hand through her hair. "Just follow me." She led him through the house, her feet heavy as she approached the basement door. Buddy whined softly, but she gave him a reassuring pat before turning the handle and stepping down. Jake followed, his boots thudding against the wooden steps. When they reached the bottom, she pointed to the exposed hole in the concrete. Jake let out a low whistle, crouching down to examine it. "That's not normal," he muttered. He reached out, touching the jagged edges of the cracked floor. "What the hell?" "It's warm," Megan said. "Feel it." Jake hesitated before pressing his palm against the dirt. His eyes widened slightly, and he pulled back. "That's not right. This place should be freezing." Megan swallowed hard. "And that's not all. Look closer." She shone the flashlight into the tunnel, directing the beam toward the spot where she had seen the clothing and the hand. Her pulse pounded as she waited for Jake's reaction. He stiffened. "Meg, is that—" "Yeah," she hugged herself. "I think was a person." Jake sat back on his heels, exhaling sharply. We need to call someone. Who? The police? What are we even going to say? That we found a tunnel under my house with, what, human remains? They'll dig it up. And if they don't find anything, they'll think I'm crazy. Jake's jaw clenched. If there are bones down there, Meg, this is serious. I know, she whispered, but it's more than that. I heard something. Something breathing. Jake's face darkened. You're sure? Yes. He stood and grabbed a heavy wrench from the nearby toolbox. All right, we check it out. If it's nothing, we call it in anyway. If it's something, then we figure it out, Megan finished. Jake gave her a wary look, but nodded. Stay behind me. And keep Buddy back. She placed a hand on Buddy's collar as Jake stepped toward the hole. The air in the basement seemed to shift, thickening with an invisible tension. Megan's stomach tightened as Jake lowered himself onto his stomach and leaned into the hole, shining the flashlight down the tunnel. Silence stretched between them. Then Jake muttered, "There's something deeper back here." Megan's fingers dug into Buddy's fur. Like what? Jake shifted, bracing himself as he leaned in further. I don't know. It's like the tunnel keeps going, but it gets bigger, like a room or something. He pulled back, his face grim. I think someone dug this out. It wasn't a natural cave-in. A chill crept through Megan's veins. So who did it? And why? Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood, dusting off his hands. We need to go down there. Megan stared at him. Are you serious? We can't just leave it. If someone was living down there, or is still living down there, we need to know. And if there are remains, we need to report them. Every part of Megan screamed against the idea, but at the same time, she knew he was right. If they walked away now, she would never sleep another night in this house without wondering what lay beneath her. Jake grabbed a rope from his truck and secured it around a support beam in the basement. I'll go first. You stay up here, and if I say it's safe, you follow. Megan's hands curled into fists, but she nodded. Be careful. Jake tested the rope before lowering himself down into the tunnel. His flashlight flickered against the packed dirt as he descended. Megan held her breath, listening to his movements, waiting for him to call back up. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, Meg. His voice was tense. You need to come see this. Her stomach turned. What is it? She called down. There was a long pause before Jake responded. Just come down, but be ready. Megan swallowed hard, her heart hammering. She turned to Buddy, running a hand over his head before securing the rope and starting her descent. The walls closed in around her as she lowered herself into the space beneath the house. The moment her feet touched the packed dirt floor, she felt it. The air was different down here, heavier, charged with something unseen. Jake stood a few feet ahead, his flashlight aimed at something in the distance. Megan followed his gaze, dread pooling in her gut. There, deeper within the tunnel, were old wooden beams propping up the walls, support structures, deliberately placed. And beyond them, a rusted metal door stood partially buried in the earth. The door was slightly ajar, and from the darkness beyond it, the faint sound of breathing continued. Megan's breath came in shallow bursts as she stared at the rusted metal door. The breathing sound beyond it remained steady, unhurried. It sent an uneasy chill up her spine, an undeniable confirmation that something, or someone, was there. Jake moved first. His grip on the flashlight tightened as he took slow, deliberate steps toward the door. Megan wanted to tell him to stop, to turn around and get out of there, but the words caught in her throat. She followed instead, each step feeling heavier than the last. The earth beneath her feet was damp, uneven, and with every cautious movement, a soft crunch echoed against the dirt walls. The wooden beams supporting the tunnel loomed above them, casting twisted shadows that danced under the beam of Jake's flashlight. The air was thick, tinged with the scent of damp soil and rusted metal. Megan swallowed hard. Jake stopped just short of the door, his head tilting slightly as he listened. Megan listened too, her entire body stiff. The breathing had changed. It wasn't steady anymore. It had become uneven, strained, almost as if whatever was beyond the door was aware of their presence. Jake shot her a look, one that held a silent question. Do we open it? Megan hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, to leave this place and never look back. But she couldn't. They had already come this far. If they left without knowing, the fear would haunt her forever. She gave a small nod. Jake took a deep breath, then reached for the door. His fingers wrapped around the rusted handle, and with a slow, careful pull, he wrenched it open. The metal groaned in protest, sending a sharp screech echoing through the tunnel. Megan's pulse spiked. The flashlight beam cut into the darkness beyond, illuminating a small, enclosed chamber. The space was no bigger than a walk-in closet, the walls made of the same packed dirt as the tunnel. But there, in the farthest corner, was what made Megan's stomach drop. A man. He was curled into himself, his knees pulled to his chest, his arms wrapped tightly around his body. His clothes were tattered, clinging to his frail frame like they had been worn for years. His hair was long and matted, his beard unkempt. But it was his eyes that stopped Megan cold. Wide, hollow, terrified. Jake took a cautious step forward. "Sir?" The man flinched violently at the sound of Jake's voice, his entire body trembling as if the simple act of hearing another human had shaken him to his core. He pressed himself tighter into the corner, as if trying to disappear into the dirt. Megan felt her stomach twist. He was afraid of them. She raised her hands slowly, palms out. "We're not here to hurt you," she said, keeping her voice soft. We didn't know anyone was down here." The man's breath hitched, his lips parting like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. His fingers clawed weakly at the dirt, his whole body shaking. Jake exchanged a glance with Megan before he crouched slightly. "Hey, it's okay. We're going to help you. Can you tell us your name?" The man's mouth moved, but no sound came out. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, and then, after what felt like forever, he whispered, "Daniel." Megan's heart clenched. "Daniel," she repeated. How long have you been down here?" Daniel blinked rapidly, his breath uneven. He shook his head, as if he didn't know. Maybe he didn't. Jake ran a hand over his face. "All right, first things first. We need to get you out of here." The second those words left Jake's mouth, Daniel's entire demeanor changed. His eyes widened even more, and he let out a hoarse, strangled sound. His hands gripped the dirt wall, his body shaking violently. "No," he gasped. "No, no, no, no! You can't!" Megan's chest tightened. "Daniel, we have to. You can't stay down here." "You don't understand," he rasped. His voice was raw, as if it hadn't been used in years. "It's not safe." Megan's stomach turned to ice. "What's not safe?" Daniel's gaze darted past them, toward the tunnel they had come from. His entire body shrank in on itself. "It's awake now. It knows you're here." A heavy silence fell over them. Jake's grip on the flashlight tightened. "What's awake?" Daniel shook his head violently. "You need to go. Now." Megan's hands went clammy. She didn't know what Daniel was talking about, but there was no mistaking the sheer, absolute terror in his eyes. A sudden, distant sound made her blood freeze. A low, rumbling vibration. Faint at first, barely noticeable, but growing stronger by the second. It felt like the very earth around them was shifting, a deep tremor that started at their feet and spread outward. Then came the noise, a dragging, shuffling sound from the tunnel. Megan's breath caught. Buddy, still at the tunnel's entrance, let out a low, warning growl. Jake swore under his breath. "Meg, we need to move." Daniel shook his head again, his breathing ragged. "You don't get it. If you run, it follows. It always follows." Megan's pulse pounded. The sound in the tunnel grew louder, closer. Buddy barked, snapping at the air, his entire body tense. Jake grabbed Daniel's arm. "We don't have time to argue. We are getting out of here. Now!" Daniel struggled weakly, but he was too frail to fight back. Megan reached out to help, wrapping an arm around his shoulders as they pulled him to his feet. His legs trembled beneath him, barely able to hold his weight. Then, the sound stopped. Dead silence. Megan's breath came in short, panicked bursts. She couldn't see anything beyond the reach of the flashlight. The tunnel ahead was just darkness. Black. Endless. Buddy whined. His tail was tucked. He was shaking. Something was out there. Watching. Jake took a deep breath. "Move. Now." Megan didn't hesitate. She helped Daniel forward, his body practically collapsing into her as they stumbled toward the tunnel entrance. Jake stayed behind them, flashlight sweeping frantically from side to side. The silence was deafening. Then, just as they reached the rope that led back up to the basement, a sound. Not breathing, not shuffling. A whisper. Low, guttural. Right behind them. Megan's breath hitched. The whisper was low, barely more than a rasp against the thick air, but it sent a chill down her spine. It was behind them. Jake stiffened, his grip tightening around Daniel's frail arm. His flashlight beam jerked, the light dancing across the dirt walls. The shadows seemed deeper now, shifting unnaturally. Megan forced her legs to move, pushing forward with Daniel half draped over her. The rope was just ahead. If they could reach it, they could climb out. Buddy whined, his body pressed low to the ground, his fur bristling as he backed up toward the basement entrance. He knew. He sensed it before any of them did. The whisper came again, closer. Jake turned, swinging the flashlight wildly behind them. The tunnel was empty, but the air had changed. It felt suffocating, thick like molasses, pressing in on them. "Go," Jake ordered. Megan didn't need to be told twice. She gritted her teeth and moved faster, ignoring the way Daniel shuddered against her. His breath was ragged, his hands clenched around her arm with a strength that surprised her. "We can't leave," he rasped suddenly. Megan almost stumbled. "What?" "It won't let you." The way he said it, final, resigned, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. But she didn't stop moving. The rope was just feet away now. Buddy had already reached the base of the ladder leading back up to the basement. Then the light flickered. Jake cursed, smacking the flashlight with his palm. The bulb sputtered, the beam wavering. The darkness around them deepened. The whispering grew louder. A shape moved at the edge of the light. Megan gasped, dragging Daniel the last few steps. She shoved him toward the rope, practically pushing him into Jake's arms. "Get him up!" Jake didn't hesitate. He braced himself, pulling Daniel up first, guiding his weak hands toward the rungs. Daniel groaned, his movements slow, as if something weighed him down. Megan turned, her heart hammering. The darkness behind them wasn't just empty air. It was something more. A void, shifting and undulating, like it had weight, like it was alive. The whispering wasn't words anymore. It was a presence, a feeling crawling into her skull, pressing against the edges of her mind. Leave. But don't run. It wasn't a command. It was a warning. Jake had nearly hoisted Daniel to the top when the rope suddenly jerked. Megan's heart leapt into her throat. Something unseen had grabbed it. The fibers groaned under the sudden force, the ladder shaking violently. Daniel gasped, nearly slipping. Jake gritted his teeth, tightening his hold. "Climb, damn it!" Daniel let out a strangled cry, his movements sluggish. Megan grabbed the rope, bracing her feet against the dirt wall. She pushed upward, shoving Daniel's frail body from below. The whispering grew into a low, droning hum, vibrating through her skull. The shape in the darkness shifted. It was watching. It was waiting. Megan's fingers slipped against the rough rope. The ladder swayed violently, and she heard something scrape along the dirt floor below. Her stomach twisted. Buddy barked wildly from above, his paws scraping against the wooden floor of the basement. Megan forced herself up, her muscles screaming as she climbed. She could feel it now. Not just the presence, but the weight of something unseen coiling beneath her, rising. The second she reached the top, Jake grabbed her wrist and yanked her up. She barely made it onto solid ground before he slammed the basement door shut behind them. The moment the door latched, the whispering stopped. Silence. The basement beneath them was still. No scraping. No breathing. Nothing. Megan collapsed onto the floor, her chest heaving. Her hands shook as she reached for Buddy, pulling him close. His body trembled against her, but he licked her face, as if reassuring himself that she was still there. Jake slumped beside her, running a hand down his face. Daniel lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, his body motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Megan swallowed hard. "What was that?" Jake exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I don't know." Daniel's voice came, hoarse and barely above a whisper. "I told you. It knows you're here now." Megan's stomach clenched. "Daniel, how long have you been down there?" Daniel's eyes flickered toward her. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, finally, he rasped, "Since I was a boy." Her breath caught. "That's impossible." Daniel gave a weak shake of his head. "Not impossible. Just forgotten." Jake's jaw tightened. "Who put you down there?" Daniel closed his eyes. "My father." The words hung heavy in the air. Megan felt her throat tighten. She didn't know what answer she had been expecting, but that wasn't it. Jake exhaled sharply. "Why?" Daniel's eyes fluttered open again, dull and glassy. "Because he found it first, and he was afraid." The room went silent. Megan exchanged a glance with Jake. It wasn't over. Not even close. Megan's hands trembled as she pressed them against the wooden floor, trying to steady herself. The silence in the basement was thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Jake sat beside her, one hand gripping his knee, the other still clutching the flashlight, its beam now pointed at nothing but the floor. Daniel lay motionless, eyes still locked on the ceiling, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. He found it first, Daniel had said. Megan swallowed hard, her throat dry. What do you mean your father found it first? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's fingers twitched against the floor, his breathing turning ragged. He knew something was down there, he murmured, voice hollow. He tried to keep it buried. He thought if he sealed the door, it would stay asleep. But it doesn't sleep. It waits. A cold chill crawled up Megan's spine. Buddy whimpered beside her, his body pressed against her leg. His ears were pinned back, his muscles tense. Jake exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. So what? Your dad just decided to lock you down there with it? What kind of father does that? Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. He thought it would keep the rest of them safe. He was wrong. Megan exchanged a glance with Jake. None of this made sense. None of it should have been real, but they had heard it. They had felt it. That whisper, that presence, it wasn't just in Daniel's head. How did you survive down there? Megan asked hesitantly. Daniel blinked slowly, like he had to think about it. It lets you live, as long as you don't try to leave. Megan felt her stomach twist. What happens if you try to leave? Daniel turned his head toward her for the first time, his eyes bloodshot and tired. You heard it, didn't you? It follows. Megan's pulse pounded in her ears. She had heard it, felt it, and she knew. Whatever it was, it had come with them. It hadn't stayed behind in the tunnel. Jake stood abruptly, his face set with determination. All right, we're not just sitting here waiting to see what happens next. We need to get out of this house, now. Megan nodded, pushing herself up to her feet. She didn't need to be told twice. Whatever had been in that tunnel was now inside their home. Staying here wasn't an option. Daniel, however, didn't move. He shook his head weakly. You can't leave. It's too late. Jake let out a frustrated breath. The hell we can't! Get up, Daniel. We're getting out of here. Daniel's expression darkened, his jaw clenching. You don't understand. It won't let you. A heavy silence settled over the room. Megan felt it before she heard it. The shift in the air, the weight pressing against her chest. Buddy let out a low growl, his body tensed like a coiled spring. Then, from the far end of the basement, something creaked. Megan's breath hitched. She turned slowly, Jake's flashlight beam following. The basement door, the same one Jake had slammed shut, was now ajar. Jake swore under his breath, his grip tightening around the flashlight. I locked that door. Daniel let out a shaky breath. It's inside now. The words sent a cold spike of terror through Megan's chest. The whispering returned. Soft, almost inviting. But this time, it wasn't coming from below. It was coming from behind them. Jake spun around, shining the light toward the stairs. The beam flickered, as if something unseen was pushing against it. The whispering grew louder, wrapping around them like a thick fog. Buddy barked, snapping at the air, his teeth bared. Megan backed up, her fingers gripping the fabric of her shirt. We need to move, now! Jake reached for Daniel, but the moment his hand touched his arm, Daniel gasped, his entire body convulsing. His back arched, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Megan felt frozen, helpless as a deep, guttural sound rumbled from Daniel's throat. Jake stumbled back. What the hell? Daniel's eyes rolled back, his body shuddering violently. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Daniel slumped forward, panting heavily. And then he whispered, It's here. A loud thud echoed from upstairs. Megan's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. Jake grabbed her arm, We're getting out of here. Now. Megan didn't argue. She grabbed Buddy's collar, dragging him with her as they rushed toward the basement steps. Jake hauled Daniel to his feet, half carrying him. The air felt heavier, thicker, like they were wading through something unseen. As they reached the stairs, another sound came, this time from the front door. A slow, deliberate knock. Megan stopped short. Jake tensed beside her. The knock came again. Louder. Megan's breath shuddered out of her. She didn't want to answer it. She didn't want to know what was on the other side. But deep down, she already knew. The knock came again, harder this time, reverberating through the walls. Megan's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around Buddy's collar. Jake's grip on Daniel didn't loosen, but she could feel the tension radiating off him. No one should have been outside. No one should have known they were here. Daniel, still weak, let out a shuddering breath. "Don't open it." Megan swallowed hard, her mind racing. "Who is it?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. Jake exchanged a glance with her, then turned toward the door. "Who's there?" Silence, then a voice. "It's me." Megan's stomach twisted. The voice was wrong. It sounded familiar, and yet off. Too hollow, too stretched, like someone trying to imitate human speech but missing the smallest inflections. Jake's jaw tightened. "Who's me?" The voice repeated itself. "It's me." Buddy growled low in his throat, his hackles rising. The air in the house felt thick, pressing against Megan's chest, making it hard to breathe. Daniel's voice came barely above a whisper. "It knows your names now." Megan's heart stopped for a moment. Then the voice changed. "Megan." She sucked in a sharp breath, her pulse hammering. Whoever, or whatever, was outside, it shouldn't have known her name. It shouldn't have sounded like that. Jake took a slow step back. "We are not opening that door." The voice mimicked him this time. "We are not opening that door." The repetition was worse than the whispering. It sent ice-cold fear crawling up Megan's spine. It wasn't just saying the words, it was learning them, testing them, twisting them into something unnatural. Then the knocking stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was their breathing and Buddy's quiet growl. The silence should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. It stretched too long, pressing in on them from all sides. Megan dared a step forward, inching closer to the front door. She hesitated, then slowly reached for the peephole, her fingers trembling. She looked. The porch was empty. Her breath came out in a shaky exhale. There was no one there, no sign of movement, no shifting shadows. But as she started to step back, something shifted. A shape moved. Just barely, out of the corner of her vision, standing too close to the door, where the peephole's angle couldn't capture it. Megan jerked away from the door, stumbling back. "There's..." Before she could finish, the house shook. A deep, vibrating force, like something massive had pressed against the walls. The lights flickered. The windows rattled. Buddy barked wildly, his tail tucked between his legs. Daniel, still slumped on the floor, let out a weak moan. "You let it get too close." Jake grabbed Megan's arm, pulling her back from the door. "We need to go. Right now." She could barely think past the fear gripping her, but she nodded. They couldn't stay here. Whatever was outside, whatever had been in that tunnel, was trying to get in. Jake moved first, keeping himself between Megan and the door. He grabbed the keys off the counter, his movements sharp, efficient. Megan scooped Buddy into her arms despite his size, feeling his trembling body pressed against hers. "Daniel, come on!" Jake hauled him to his feet. Daniel groaned but didn't resist. His legs were weak, unsteady, but he moved. The second they reached the door to the garage, the knocking returned. Harder, louder. And this time it came from every wall at once. The sound reverberated through the house, shaking the very foundation. It wasn't knocking anymore. It was pounding, hammering, as if something enormous was trying to break its way inside. Megan's breath came in short gasps as Jake yanked open the door to the garage. The motion-activated lights flickered to life, casting long, eerie shadows across the concrete floor. "Get in the car," Jake barked. Megan didn't hesitate. She ran for the passenger door, Buddy still clutched tightly to her chest. Daniel stumbled after her, his breaths shallow and ragged. Jake threw open the driver's side door and shoved the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. The pounding on the house stopped. The silence was worse. Megan's hands tightened around Buddy as Jake reversed down the driveway, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead. But the house behind them. Megan turned to look, and her stomach twisted. The front door was wide open. Not broken, not splintered, just open. And in the darkness beyond it, something moved. Not a person, not an animal. Something else. The whisper came again, drifting through the open space between them. It was still learning. And it wasn't done. Megan's heart pounded as the car sped down the darkened road. The house behind them shrank into the distance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Something had watched them leave. Something had let them go, for now. Buddy whined softly, his body still tense in her lap. Megan stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her mind spinning. Jake's grip on the wheel was tight, his knuckles white. Daniel slumped against the back seat, let out a ragged breath. "Where are we going?" Megan finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer at first. His eyes stayed locked on the road, scanning every shadow as if expecting something to step out in front of them. Finally, he said, "Somewhere with people. Lights. Anywhere but there." Megan swallowed hard. "It's not just the house." Jake's jaw clenched. "I know." Silence settled between them, broken only by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of Buddy's breathing. Megan couldn't stop replaying what had happened in her mind. The knocking. The voice that had called her name. The way the door had been open, waiting for them to see inside. Daniel stirred slightly. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "It won't stop." Megan turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" His fingers twitched against his leg. "You don't leave it. It leaves you. When it's ready." A chill ran through her. She glanced at Jake, but his face was unreadable, his focus still locked on the road ahead. Megan looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past 2 in the morning. The town was a good 15 miles away. Nothing but empty road and thick trees surrounded them now. She hated how vulnerable that made her feel. She leaned closer to Buddy, seeking some kind of comfort in his warmth. "Daniel, how did you survive all this time?" Daniel's breathing was shallow, his voice barely more than a breath. "I never left." Megan frowned. "But you were down there for years. How did you—" Daniel's head turned slightly, his unfocused eyes locking onto hers. "I never left." Her stomach twisted. Was he saying he had been down there since he was a child? That didn't make sense. No one could survive like that. And yet, the way he said it, the certainty in his voice. The car suddenly jerked as Jake slammed on the brakes. Megan lurched forward, her seatbelt tightening against her chest. Buddy barked sharply, claws scrabbling against the leather seat. "What the hell?" Megan started, but her voice died as she followed Jake's gaze. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure. Megan's blood ran cold. It wasn't moving, just standing there, silhouetted by the dim headlights. The shape was human, but wrong. Its arms were slightly too long. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. The longer she looked at it, the more it felt like it wasn't standing still at all. It was shifting, almost vibrating, just at the edges of her vision. Jake's breathing was harsh. He gripped the wheel like he was about to throw the car into reverse. "Megan, tell me you see that." She couldn't answer, could barely think. The figure took a step forward. Buddy growled low in his throat, pressing himself against Megan. The air in the car felt thick, suffocating. Another step. Megan felt a jolt of panic. "Jake!" The headlights flickered. Just for a second. When they came back, the figure was closer. Jake cursed and slammed the car into reverse. The tires squealed as they lurched backward. The figure didn't move, but Megan had the sickening feeling that it didn't need to. Daniel's voice came from the back seat, barely more than a whisper. "It doesn't have a face." Megan's breath hitched. Her gaze locked onto the figure again. The headlights flickered once more, and this time the figure was gone. Jake didn't stop reversing until they were nearly 100 feet back. His hands were shaking on the wheel. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. Megan had no answer. She turned, her eyes landing on Daniel. His face was pale, but he didn't look surprised. "It's watching," he said. "It knows we left." Jake ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. "We need to get to town. We're not stopping again, no matter what." Megan nodded quickly. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her jeans, trying to stop herself from shaking. Jake put the car back in drive and sped down the road, not daring to look back. The town was still a few miles away. But Megan knew in her gut that they weren't outrunning whatever had followed them. It wasn't done with them yet. The road stretched on endlessly, swallowed by the darkness beyond the reach of the car's headlights. Megan clutched Buddy to her chest, feeling the rhythmic thudding of his heart against her own. Jake's grip on the steering wheel was so tight his knuckles were nearly white. Daniel sat slumped in the back, his breathing shallow but steady. No one spoke. No one dared to. Megan kept glancing into the side mirrors, expecting to see something moving behind them, something impossibly fast keeping pace with the car. Every time the headlights flickered, even for a fraction of a second, she sucked in a sharp breath. It had happened before. It could happen again. They had seen something. Something that shouldn't exist. And now it knew they had seen it. Jake's voice broke the silence, low and tight. "We're not stopping. Not until we reach town." Megan nodded, though she knew he couldn't see her. "How much farther?" 8 miles. Too far." Buddy let out a low growl, his ears pinned back. Megan's grip on his fur tightened. "He senses something." Daniel shifted in the back seat, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's following us." Megan turned, her stomach twisting. "What?" Daniel didn't look at her. He was staring straight ahead, his body unnaturally still. "It always follows. It doesn't lose people. It doesn't need to." Jake let out a sharp breath. "That's not helping." Daniel closed his eyes. "I didn't say it to help." The headlights flickered again. This time, the darkness outside seemed deeper, thicker. Megan swore she saw movement in the trees lining the road, shifting shadows that didn't belong. She dug her nails into her palm, trying to convince herself she was imagining things. A whisper filled the car. It was soft, barely distinguishable over the hum of the engine, but Megan knew she hadn't imagined it. The sound wrapped around them, slipping through the air like fingers reaching for something unseen. Buddy let out a sharp bark, snapping at nothing. Jake pressed his foot harder on the gas pedal. "No one look back." Megan bit her lip. Every part of her wanted to glance over her shoulder to see if something was waiting for them in the rearview mirror, but the fear locked her in place. Daniel exhaled shakily. "It's not behind us." Megan's skin prickled. Then where? The car lurched violently. Something had hit them. Hard. Jake swore, wrestling with the wheel to keep the car steady. The tires screeched as the vehicle veered sideways before he corrected it, forcing them back onto the road. Megan's heart pounded. "What was that?" Jake didn't answer. He was looking at the hood of the car, his breath coming fast. Megan followed his gaze. There was something on the windshield, not a body, not an animal. A handprint, but it wasn't human. The fingers were too long, the proportions all wrong. The skin looked stretched, impossibly thin, as if something had pressed against the glass from the outside, while they were moving. The whisper came again. This time it was inside the car. Buddy barked wildly, his whole body shaking. Megan pressed back into her seat, eyes darting around trying to find the source of the sound. Daniel was trembling, his hands clenching into fists. "It's already here." Jake yanked the wheel, swerving hard. The handprint on the windshield smeared as if whatever had made it had dragged its fingers across the glass. The car sped forward, headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. Megan turned to Daniel. "What do we do?" Daniel's breath shuddered. "You don't run from it." Jake let out a humorless laugh. "Great advice, considering we're literally running from it." Daniel's eyes met hers, dark and hollow. "You have to face it." Megan shook her head. "No, no way. We're getting to town. We're finding people. We're not..." The whispering turned into a low, guttural growl. The car jolted again. And then, without warning, the headlights cut out. Darkness swallowed them whole. The darkness was absolute. Megan's breath hitched as she clutched Buddy tighter, his trembling body pressed against her chest. The car had plunged into an abyss, the headlights cutting out so completely it was as if they had never been on in the first place. "Jake!" Megan's voice cracked. "I know," Jake snapped, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The car was still moving, the tires gliding over asphalt, but without the headlights, it felt like they were driving blind through an endless void. A deep, guttural whisper curled through the cabin, pressing against their ears. It didn't come from any single direction. It was everywhere, surrounding them, seeping into their skin. Megan squeezed her eyes shut. "Jake, turn them back on." "I'm trying!" He twisted the switch, flicked the high beams, but nothing happened. The dashboard lights remained on, casting an eerie blue glow on their faces, but the world outside remained pitch black. Then came the pressure. A force, unseen but undeniable, pressed against the car. The metal groaned, the windows shuddered. The sensation wasn't like a crash or a bump. It was as if something massive was wrapping around them, testing the structure, feeling for weak spots. Buddy whined and buried his head into Megan's arm. She felt his heartbeat racing against her own. Daniel exhaled a ragged breath from the back seat. "It's here." Megan whipped around to face him. "What do you mean, it's here?" Daniel's hands clenched into fists, his eyes wide and distant. "It's testing us, seeing if we'll let it in." Jake swore under his breath and slammed his foot on the gas. The car jolted forward, the engine roaring against the silence. The pressure around them didn't lessen. If anything, it intensified, dragging at them like invisible hands, trying to pull them back into the dark. Then, just as suddenly as they had gone out, the headlights flared back to life. Megan sucked in a breath. The road stretched ahead, empty, silent. The trees lining the highway seemed taller now, their shadows cast unnaturally long under the harsh glow of the headlights. And then she saw them. Figures. Dozens of them stood at the edge of the forest, barely visible beyond the reach of the light. They didn't move. They didn't shift. They just watched. Jake's hands tensed around the wheel. "Megan, do you see?" "Yes," she whispered. Daniel's voice was eerily calm. "Don't look at them too long." Megan tore her gaze away, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The figures hadn't been there before. And yet somehow, it felt like they had always been watching. The whispering returned, louder this time, vibrating through the air like a chant. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language Megan had ever heard. It was ancient, guttural, a voice that didn't belong in this world. Buddy let out a sharp bark, snapping at nothing. Megan grabbed his collar, her fingers digging into the fabric. "Jake, keep driving." "I am," he gritted out. "Just hold on." The figures didn't move, but their presence weighed heavy against them. The whispering wove through the air, wrapping around them like invisible tendrils. Daniel shuddered. "It's almost done." Megan turned to him sharply. "What's almost done?" He let out a slow breath. "The choice." Before she could ask him what he meant, the figures lining the road began to shift. Not toward them, not away, but inward, collapsing into themselves like smoke dissipating into the air. The pressure in the car lifted. The whispering faded. Megan's pulse thundered in her ears. What just happened? Jake didn't answer, his eyes locked on the road ahead. Daniel leaned back against the seat, his body limp. "It let us go." Megan felt no relief, only dread. "Why?" Daniel's lips barely moved. "Because it wanted us to know." The road ahead stretched on, empty once more. But Megan knew they weren't safe. Not yet. Megan's hands tightened around Buddy as she stared at the empty road ahead. The whispering had stopped. The figures had vanished. But the feeling hadn't left. The weight of unseen eyes still clung to her skin, as if the darkness itself had fingers, brushing over her arms, her neck, her spine. Jake's knuckles were still white against the steering wheel. The silence inside the car was thick, oppressive. It felt wrong, like a held breath waiting to be released. Daniel hadn't spoken again, his body still slumped in the back seat, but Megan could hear his uneven breathing. They had been let go. That's what Daniel had said. But what if that wasn't a kindness? "What now?" Megan finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake exhaled through his nose, his eyes locked on the road. "We don't stop. We keep driving until we hit the next town." "And then what?" Megan pressed. "We go to the police and tell them what? That the darkness tried to eat us?" Jake didn't answer. Daniel shifted in the back, his breath hitching slightly. "You don't tell anyone?" Megan turned in her seat. "Excuse me?" Daniel's eyes were open now, glassy, distant. "You can't tell anyone. That's part of the deal." A chill swept over her skin. "The deal?" Daniel's fingers twitched against his leg. It lets you go, but you don't talk about it. You don't bring it back into the world. You act like it never happened. Megan felt her pulse in her throat. That's ridiculous. People disappear all the time. If this thing, whatever it is, has been doing this for years, why doesn't anyone know? Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. Because the ones who escape keep their mouths shut. The weight of his words sank into her bones. Megan turned back toward the windshield, staring at the highway stretching endlessly ahead. She wanted to argue, to say she wouldn't just pretend nothing happened. But deep down, she already knew Daniel was right. There was something about it, about the figures, about the whispering, that didn't belong in the world of the living. Speaking about it, giving it words would bring it closer, make it real again. And Megan wasn't sure she could survive that a second time. Jake glanced at the rearview mirror, his voice tight. So what? We just go on like normal? Daniel nodded. That's the only way. The thought made Megan's stomach turn. She felt raw, like something had been taken from her, some part of herself she'd never get back. But Jake kept driving, the miles slipping away beneath the tires, and with every turn of the wheel, the world felt just a little more normal, a little less dark. And yet when she glanced at the trees lining the road, she still felt it. A presence. Watching. Waiting. The next town was still miles away, but with each passing moment, Megan felt the tension in her shoulders ease just a little. She had almost convinced herself that they were truly free, that the nightmare was over. But then Buddy let out a sharp bark, jolting her out of her thoughts. She followed his gaze out the window, heart hammering. The trees. They had been distant before, their dark silhouettes standing at the roadside like silent sentinels. But now, they seemed closer, as if the road had narrowed, or as if the trees had moved. Jake swore under his breath. This road wasn't this tight before. Daniel let out a sharp exhale. It's still with us. Megan's stomach clenched. But you said it let us go. Daniel's voice was almost too quiet to hear. It did. But it doesn't mean it left. Megan turned her head slowly, her breath catching as she spotted something between the trees. A shape. Tall, impossibly thin, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. But it was there. Buddy growled, his fur bristling against her arms. Jake's hands tensed on the wheel. Tell me you see that. I see it, Megan whispered. Daniel took in a shaky breath. Don't react. Megan clenched her teeth. A little late for that. The whispering returned. This time, it wasn't outside the car. It was inside. A breath against her ear. A voice that shouldn't have been there. You are not supposed to leave. Megan slapped her hands over her ears, panic surging through her veins. Jake, go faster. Jake pressed down on the gas, the car lurching forward. The trees blurred past them, but the figures remained, slipping through the gaps like shadows untethered from reality. The faster they drove, the more Megan felt their presence pressing in. Daniel let out a strained whisper. It's testing us again. What do we do? Megan's voice was tight with fear. Daniel hesitated. We don't let it win. Jake's foot was already on the floor, the speedometer climbing higher. How do we do that? Daniel met Megan's eyes. We stop being afraid. Megan let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Great. I'll just flip a switch and pretend none of this is happening. Daniel didn't blink. You have to. Fear feeds it. Doubt lets it in. Jake's knuckles turned white on the wheel. So we stop believing? Daniel nodded once. Yes. Megan forced herself to look forward, to push down the terror clawing at her chest. The whispering was still there, slithering through the car like smoke. But as she took a breath, something changed. The pressure eased. Not entirely, but enough. The trees didn't seem as close. The figures weren't as solid. The road ahead stretched wider, the headlights cutting through the darkness more cleanly. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It's working. Daniel sagged against the seat. It won't be forever, but it's enough. Megan swallowed. Then we keep going. The car continued down the road, the whispering fading until it was barely there at all. The figures in the trees thinned, their presence dissipating like mist. And then, finally, the first glimmers of street lights appeared on the horizon. They had made it. And yet Megan couldn't help but feel that whatever had been in that darkness wasn't finished with them. The road ahead was bright, and the town loomed closer, but her hands still trembled. She tried to convince herself it was the adrenaline wearing off, the aftershocks of what they had just survived. But deep down she knew better. There were rules now, unwritten, but understood. Don't speak of it. Don't look back. Don't give it a reason to return. Jake pulled into the first gas station they saw, the bright fluorescent lights a glaring contrast to the shadowy woods they'd left behind. He killed the engine and turned toward her, his eyes weary. "We're here," he said, his voice low. Megan nodded, her throat dry. She opened the door and stepped out, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Buddy jumped down after her, staying close to her side. For the first time in hours, she felt something close to safety. Daniel stumbled out of the back seat, his movements stiff and unsteady. Megan reached out to steady him, and he gave her a small nod of thanks. Inside the gas station, everything was painfully ordinary. Rows of snacks, a humming refrigerator case, a bored cashier scrolling on his phone. It was surreal how normal it all seemed. Megan grabbed a bottle of water, twisting off the cap and drinking deeply. The cold liquid grounded her, if only a little. Jake stood by the counter, leaning heavily against it. "We should keep going," he said. "Find a motel. Somewhere we can sleep for a few hours." Daniel didn't respond. He was staring at the floor, his expression distant. Megan touched his arm gently. "Hey, are you okay?" He blinked and looked up at her. "I told you. You have to forget it." Megan frowned. "Daniel, I mean it," he said, his voice sharp. "You can't let it back in. You have to act like it never happened." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "What if someone asks? What if—" "Don't," Daniel interrupted. "You don't talk about it. Not to anyone. Not ever." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Megan nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just warning them. He was pleading. They left the gas station and got back in the car. The road ahead was well lit now, lined with familiar signs and markers. It looked like any other small town, the kind Megan had driven through 100 times without a second thought. But it wasn't the same. Nothing would be the same. As they pulled into the motel parking lot, Megan glanced at Buddy. He was calmer now, his ears relaxed, his tail wagging faintly. She reached down and scratched behind his ears, drawing comfort from the simple gesture. They checked into a room, the mundane act of signing a clipboard and taking a key almost laughable after what they'd been through. Inside, the bed was plain, The walls were beige, and the small television sat on a rickety stand. It was the most welcoming sight Megan had ever seen. Jake dropped onto one of the beds, exhaling heavily. Finally, Megan sat on the other bed, Buddy hopping up beside her. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling, and tried to let her mind go blank. But it was impossible. The events of the night replayed over and over, each moment more vivid than the last. Daniel sat in a chair by the window, his face hidden in the shadows. Megan couldn't tell if he was awake or asleep, and she didn't ask. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply. The fluorescent light from the gas station had been reassuring, the motel's familiarity a comfort. But the true test would come when they turned out the lights, when the world went dark again. Could she close her eyes and not see the figures? Could she let herself drift into sleep without hearing the whispers? The thought terrified her, but she didn't have a choice. She reached over, clicked off the bedside lamp, and pulled the blanket over her shoulders. Buddy nestled against her, his warmth a small comfort. She focused on his steady breathing, the rise and fall of his chest. In and out, in and out. It took a long time, but eventually Megan's eyes grew heavy. The whispers didn't come. The darkness stayed silent. And for the first time since the nightmare began, she slept.